Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, welcome. Very warm welcome to today's webinar on cybersecurity essentials. My name is Daisy Radford, and I'm the Head of Operations and Delivery for BAE Systems Cyber here in Singapore. I'm also a member of the British Chamber of Commerce ICT Committee, but today my most important title is of the panel moderator, and what a great panel we have for you. Before we get started, just a bit of context on behind what we'll be covering today. So this webinar has come up due to popular request, and it's really not a surprise. We look at the sophistication and the frequency of cyber attacks that we're seeing these days, and on the level of responsibility that people are taking. It's no longer just IT teams' responsibility to deal with cyber issues. It is now everyone's, which is fantastic for us in the industry. It makes us a lot more popular at different parties. So let me introduce the panel and we'll get cracking with some of the questions. Apologies, my daughter has just come home from school. We have Chris Pearson, who is Senior Vice President of Cyber Risk at Kroll. We have Sharshanka Bhattacharya, who is a security solutions architect for cloud at Microsoft. Saeed Abdul Rahman Altgoff, who is the regional sales specialist in cloud and endpoint security for ASEAN Korea at Cisco Systems. Thank you so much, guys, for joining, and apologies for the background interruption. Very illustrious titles and definitely the knowledge to back them up. So without anything further, we'll get started. Just a reminder for our audience, this will be recorded, so it will be available on the British Chamber's on-demand feature on their website, which means that you can look back on it in your own time. Okay, let's start with a nice difficult question. And Shank, I'll be looking at you. If you can start us off by just advising what the company leadership teams need to be doing right now in order to protect from cyber threats.
All right. Thanks, Daisy, for having me here, firstly. So a few things that a company should be looking at is first to understand where their data lies. We see that a lot of companies have many different types of data, have it in different locations. And a huge factor goes into protecting all of this data, right? So think about what generally happens when we look at attacks, right? So generally attacks are happening mainly around holding you ransom for money or stealing your IP generally, right? And when it comes to stealing your IP, one of the biggest challenges companies face these days is, where is my data? Where does my data reside? So the first step to do is discovery of it, figure it out in terms of where it is there on users' laptops, file systems, databases, etc. The second part of it is then to look at how can I classify or categorize all of this data, right? Now, when we say classify or categorize, I basically mean, hey, is this supposed to be for the sales team? Is it supposed to be for marketing? Is it supposed to be internal? Is it supposed to go out externally, etc., right? So we think about how we categorize this data, right? Now, if you've just done these two steps, you're almost there. About 60 to 70% of your project actually, in terms of time, is spent on doing these two steps. The third step is then protection of data. Now, what happens if your data goes outside your organization where it's not supposed to? If you think about it from a financial sector equivalent, and if you think about even within the organization, how do you stop insider trading, for example, right? How do you make sure that your customers' data is not leaked out? How do you make sure that your customers are not contacted without their consent, for example? So even within companies, you need to make sure that files are assigned to different departments, assigned to different projects, etc., right? And the final part of it is retention, which is basically, if you look at how long does this data need to exist in the hands of the people responsible, right? So for example, if you think about a hospitality sector, right? Under HIPAA, for instance, you will have to maintain patient records for about 7 years. Now, after 7 years, you will have to let that data go, right? So you obviously want to look at automating this entire process. Now, this is basically looking at it from a file equivalent, right? So you're looking at protecting the file at the file layer itself, at the data layer itself, so that even if data gets leaked out, there is a way to stop it, and it doesn't fall into wrong hands. So that's one of the first things to do. Couple of things to keep in mind for anybody who's a CISO, a CIO, a CTO for any given organization, is to look at that the threats are not just coming from outside in, it's also coming from inside out at this point of time. To make sure that as a user, as somebody who's leading a particular department or the organization, to absolutely ensure that you have a system to monitor signals. Threats are not like how they used to be before. They are continuously evolving. And given the current state of affairs that we are in right now, given the pandemic, given the war, etc., these are increasing manifold, right? And the one thing that companies absolutely need to know is that most of hacks, most of these intrusions basically take advantage of human, right? Our emotions, our vulnerabilities, and that's how they get into it. So basically, it's not just important to have security at the front door, but it is absolutely important to understand signals coming from within as well. So these are a couple of things I think companies need to keep in mind while going ahead.
Yeah, so you say a couple things there, Shank. You really covered quite a spectrum of items that we need to consider: the regulatory requirements, the sophistication, the insider threat. Absolutely. I'm assuming, because definitely for me, what triggers when you start listing off these things is that's going to cost something, that's going to cost something. So maybe Said, we could go to you. And in the world where we don't have unlimited budget, no matter how much popular we're getting, what are those really core investments that need to be made? What gives companies the biggest bang for their buck when it comes to cyber defenses?
Thanks, Daisy, and thank you, British Chamber of Commerce, for inviting me over to this. So that's a very interesting question, right? And as much as we hope that all organizations have an abundance of money to spend on cybersecurity, in reality, it's not. So, however, to think about security, protection really has to be evaluated on a multi-front strategy, right? Because there are a lot of different threat vectors that are being exploited today. And like Shank said earlier, when we're looking at a very common malware like ransomware, if we're looking at how it kind of traverses, how it did its behavior, there's a couple of things that we need to look at. So firstly, the delivery is typically through email via phishing. Execution is typically done through the endpoint via some form of file. And then once it's executed, it starts propagating through the networks. How can we stop against that? And then the final piece of the puzzle is really on the the encryption piece, where it reaches out into a command and control service or a different C2 site where it starts exfiltrating the data out. So that alone for this particular ransomware, it's 4 different vectors of attacks that an organization would typically have to look at, right? So if you don't have enough money, it doesn't mean that one threat vector is more important than the other. I would say that it is more important to look at it more holistically. Look at what you have in your environment today, what kind of applications you're using, what kind of data, where is your data residing, like what Sheng said, what kind of user behavior there is, and then start on this journey to develop an effective security posture. So a couple of things over there, right? But then, every organization does have to prioritize in one way or the other. So I would say at the most basic form, start with the perimeter and endpoint security, because that is kind of the first and last line of defense. Those are typically more basic. And then the next step is really to adopt something along the lines of the zero trust architecture. Passwords are a very common source of a breach, and implementing something as simple as multi-factor authentication that helps to a great extent in terms of stopping threats or stopping a particular compromise. And then to look at things like user device trust. Right? So those are maybe the first two things. And then we need to look at protection of the traffic that's going out to the internet, where your users are going, what kind of threats that are out there. Try to do this in a more real-time approach. And then go into more sophisticated avenues like segmentation of the networks, baselining what is the commonality in terms of the traffic that's going through your network, stuff like that. Right. So there are a lot of different frameworks out there. So zero trust framework being one of them that maybe organizations can take a look at. There are also frameworks like the SASE framework, which advises on using cloud-based solutions that are typically more consolidated, easier to consume for smaller organizations as well as big. And if you don't have the expertise, I've worked with a number of organizations that actually reach out to a managed security service provider, right? Because they don't have the expertise, the IT team is very lean, and the end goal ideally is just to make sure that you're protected and to have the mindset that you will be eventually breached, but when you do, how fast can you detect against it? How quickly can you remediate against it? And to have this good security posture. Because when it comes to cost, ultimately, the cost of a breach would primarily be a lot more significant than what you can spend on these solutions, I would say. Yeah.
No, absolutely. That sentiment of when rather than if is certainly something that we encourage everyone to be thinking of when it comes to cyber. Chris, over to you. What would be your recommendations on where budget needs to be focused?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Syed said. Personally, I'm of the opinion that cybersecurity doesn't have to cost a ridiculous amount of money, and certainly to get started in cybersecurity. So, you know, what I always say is do something. Like just what a company needs to do is to just raise its awareness. It needs to understand, again, what Shankar said. It needs to understand what's important to the company. And where it is and how you can possibly protect that from somebody coming to either steal it or encrypt it, or, you know, whatever they want to do with it. So I always point towards the basics, always the basics. I deal with cyber breaches, so I meet people on the worst day of their career. And it's always the simple things that have been overcome. So it's people reusing passwords, it's IT managers using the same accounts on different pieces of equipment or the same accounts on their endpoints. So I think a lot of it comes down to the basics, like hiring the right IT staff, training them, retaining them, getting support from the board or from the ownership of the company. And, you know, just don't overcomplicate things. Make it a simple system. Put in the basics like multi-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication. It's literally a magic wand. Well, maybe not that good, but it's the most important thing you can do in your environment today. So understand your systems and use simple measures, which a lot of these measures are free or cheap. I mean, Microsoft 365 multi-factor authentication, completely free. And you'd be amazed at how many people don't switch on. So switch on today, and you've just gone from here to here.
There's some really great tips there, even ones for free. Shank, you should have pitched that yourself from Microsoft perspective. No, but yeah, I think, and from hearing from you all, although you're all sharing very similar views of it, I think the overarching message is really that holistic view is very important. And Chris, to your point, not having to overcomplicate it, but in order to try and look across the board, focusing in one area too much will certainly leave another area vulnerable. So thinking of those vulnerabilities, let's start looking at kind of the developments in the world right now. So both in terms of what we're seeing in the cyber world and in the physical world with what's happening in Europe right now, what is the kind of the elements that the leadership teams need to be working on today in order to mitigate risks coming in the future? Chris, maybe we could start with you.
Well, I don't think anybody will be surprised if I bring up the two main events that are going on in the world right now, and that's COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine. I mean, COVID-19 is probably the one that has the biggest impact to small and medium businesses, certainly, because it's forced a lot of people to work from home, and that's a thing that's not going away. So businesses of all sizes have spent a lot of money on their infrastructure, the servers and firewalls and infrastructure in their offices. And then all of a sudden, overnight, that perimeter has changed from inside of your own castle, if you will, to all of your employees' houses, wherever they might live. And those employees might have, a 20-year-old internet router. They might have other personal devices on the network that have been compromised in some way, which then can leapfrog into your company devices. They might have nosy housemates who look over their shoulder. They might be in a high crime area. They might have their laptop stolen with critical data on. They're taking laptops backwards and forwards on trains, sitting in the pub and leaving it there. And it's basically just such a massive exposure of your equipment and therefore your data, which is being caused by this. So what can you do to improve that? I mean, firstly, you need to look at endpoint security and endpoint hardening. So if you take a laptop from your office and you leave it in the street, you need to be confident that the person that picks that up is not able to remove any data from it. And that, again, is something that you can do absolutely free. The technology has been around for a long time, and all you need to do is switch it on. What else? So secure connectivity back into your environment using two-factor authentication again. In breaches, in the last 10 breaches I've done, almost always the threat actor has come in through an unsecured VPN. I can't stress it enough, turn onto it. What else? I mean, some clients of mine have actually gone fully cloud-based. So they've done away with their internal infrastructure. They've built, a very safe and well-protected cloud-based infrastructure. They don't even need a VPN anymore because they have no technology in their office bar an internet connection. And obviously, secondly, we've got the war in Ukraine, which a lot of people have been warning us about, especially Russian hackers going on the offensive against infrastructure, governmental organizations and all that kind of thing. We haven't actually seen many impacts around that. And I've heard some chatter from smaller companies, small to medium businesses, since become really quiet because maybe the Russian hackers are concentrating on governmental infrastructure. They're not so much going after, the quick buck from the company down the road, but they're trying to wage war on the West in the cyber domain.
Yeah, I think that's right, Chris. Certainly in terms of what we're seeing, BAE Systems working with our national security customers, and there certainly has been an increase in that landscape, but on the more commercial basis, yeah, surprisingly has gone a bit quiet. Shank, maybe we can go to you, being the cloud expert on the panel. And Saeed touched on the use of cloud, and Chris just mentioned it there as well. Could you share a bit around cloud security and what that offers companies?
Right. So, I mean, I'll just have a segue with what Chris actually mentioned. What cloud actually brings is collaboration across different entities. not just working with the different security vendors, but also agencies like Interpol, etc. And it's a collective intelligence that is actually used to protect end users, right? So that's something that is an advantage with cloud as compared to, let's say, if you're looking at a segregated format of it, where you do continuously need to update your systems for the latest threats, for instance, right? A way to look at this is very simple. Always know that whenever we start cybersecurity discussions, we start with identity. Chris, again, I can't mention this enough, multi-factor authentication, but look at identity first and understand that we are talking about people at the end of the day. Look at what happened during the advent of the pandemic. When you're looking at 2020, for instance, right? We saw that the volume of malware that was actually coming in was absolutely paralleling the fear in people. So whenever there's an announcement that, okay, there is a new strain that is coming up, or this is a pandemic, there's X amount of people who are dying, etc., right? At the same time, we also saw that equivalent amount of volume, and it was mimicking exactly the same pattern, right? So you see that people or hackers, organizations have the tools to mobilize themselves really, really quickly if they want to. So cloud infrastructure in that way basically has a sort of an intelligent security graph, which basically looks at all the different components across the world and then make sense of it using ML, which is machine learning, to make sense of, okay, these are the patterns of different attacks that are happening way faster than modular systems, right? The other part of it, which Chris mentioned, was if you think about it from a war equivalent from Ukraine, yes, the Russian attacks have been concentrated a lot on Ukraine to begin with. A lot of it is actually spilled over as well. But different formats of attacks have actually started to emerge even more right now, especially when you're talking about OT attacks, which is operational technology attacks. And nations are, they are very wary about hacks on electricity grids and things like that, any IoT systems. And IoT systems are at this point of time not taken in the same level of seriousness as the other parts are, but they should be even more because they can cause physical harm. But these are trends that are actually emerging. The advantage with cloud and when you're moving things to cloud is you are not facing the brunt of attacks. Cloud is facing it for you. And because there is a lot of AI and ML built in the background of it, you get to be safer by adopting cloud security services, right? A few other things which are, which would be otherwise very heavy on the systems to understand user behavior patterns. This becomes an advantage in cloud. Like, for example, if you're logging in from Singapore, and then let's say within the next 10 minutes, you're logging in from Taiwan, you're trying to log in multiple times, you're logging from multiple different devices. All of these are simple ones, but based on the amount of data that is needed to traverse to understand signals, cloud becomes much more effective in terms of protection in that regard.
Yeah, it is really interesting when you start to look at how cloud can support different companies. But Shank, I know you're very interested in governance and compliance as well. Could you just make sure that the audience is fully aware of when we're talking about cybersecurity, particularly in the sense of data protection, the compliance rules doesn't hand everything over to the cloud provider, does it? The responsibility still does sit in terms of accessing that data appropriately.
That's correct. So it's a shared responsibility model. So obviously the regulations have to do with where does your data reside? In this case, all of the principals, and the principals need to adhere by a few regulations themselves. They have to follow. For example, if you're thinking about from Singapore perspective, there is a regulation for MTCS, and there are different levels for it. Or if you're thinking about PDPA, if you're thinking about from a financial equivalent, MASDRM, for instance, ABS OSPAR, for instance. So all of these regulatory bodies look at it in twofold. One is what your vendor is doing, and they have their responsibility to cover, but also what you are doing in terms of your principal data, right? So if you think about it from, let's say, a financial sector and what you're doing with your customers' data. So obviously, let's say, for example, if it is in Microsoft that you're hosting, obviously Microsoft does have a responsibility to make sure that whenever there is any sort of hack that or any sort of breach that has happened, there are the appropriate bodies to notify, appropriate people to notify, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things are taken care of by the principals. But even as a company who's hosting data, let's say on Microsoft, for instance, you would also have to go through quite a few things, like the things that I was mentioning earlier. If you are under a particular industry vertical, they have their own set of rules that you have to follow, right? In case of a breach, for example, if you think about PDPA, which every single organization within Singapore does need to follow, right? There are clauses like if there is a breach where your customer data is leaked out, you have to notify the authorities by 72 hours, or there are different sort of fines levied on you, right? So all of these are shared responsibilities. Now, for a person who is looking at how do I get to a point where I can say I'm compliant, know that all the basics are kind of similar. So you don't need to really break your head too much either. A lot of the control points between different regulations are basically trying to do the same thing, and that is protect the users from their data being leaked out, right? So you will see that a lot of the control mechanisms are similar. And as Syed was mentioning earlier, create a baseline, a protection baseline, so that you kind of like protect your identity and protect your data. You will be at least 60 to 70% through most regulations in any case. So create the baseline first.
Shank, I set you up perfectly to bring two-factor authentication in again there as well. So, but again, you're right, that shared responsibility, and for the leadership teams of companies, making sure that the employees are trained and the systems are in place, that access to that data is appropriately protected. Yeah, brilliant. So we're going through some really great examples. What I was wondering if we could do now is kind of focus in on what your companies as security experts do for themselves. So it's very easy for us when we're speaking to customers to use case studies that we've done for other customers. But let's just try and give some examples from our own organizations. So Saeed, can we start with you? How does Cisco really protect their platforms and services?
Okay, so I like one thing that Chris mentioned earlier. The two big events that happened recently, right? So COVID being one of them, and then the war being another. So I think the significance of what COVID did to a lot of organizations, including Cisco, is the move to hybrid work, right? So in Cisco, personally, we've been doing this for a while. Even before the pandemic, I was working at home for maybe 3 out of 5 days, right? But that's just a small group of people within the organization. Whereas now, we recently did a survey post-pandemic. I would say post-pandemic, February this year, and the respondents said that 73% of the respondents in APJC actually chose to work more than 3 days at home, right? Compared to 23%, which was pre-pandemic, right? Or at the very start of it. So this move to hybrid work is real. And me speaking to a lot of organizations out there, they are also feeling the pinch in terms of how they can do security for this. So I'll start with what Cisco did recently, right? Adopting that whole zero trust approach and moving away from VPN to a certain extent. And this is interesting because Cisco is one of the biggest, I would say, VPN providers out there with our AnyConnect client. And for us to move away, not completely, but move away from VPN is actually a big thing. But we wanted to make it more seamless for those employees working from home to access corporate applications that are still residing within the data center, right? But of course, as Shang mentioned as well, there's a lot of applications moving out to the cloud. and we've been transitioning to this. So there is that identity checks that happen, multi-factor, device trust. So Microsoft has their own MFA. In Cisco, we utilize Duo, so it's kind of similar. But what Duo would then help us do internally is to check on the user behavior. So again, things like, as what Shank has mentioned, login behavior, and to understand device posture as well, right? Because the thing that you want to ensure is that when somebody tries to log into a corporate application that is sanctioned, the user is who he or she says he is, and the device that the person is using is clean from vulnerabilities as much as possible, right? Because those are very common ways of people getting breached or threats coming into an organization. So that is really what Cisco is doing. And then an always-on security approach for people working from home, right? So we utilize an agent-based approach that wherever, whether we're on or off the VPN, whichever network we are sitting in, IT does get visibility into which destination we're going out to the internet, whether good or bad for employees. But there is that enforcement based on both threats, sensitive data with DLP, as well as categories or websites that we're not supposed to go to as part of an organization, right? So I would say that is really what we have been doing. And then for the users themselves and internally within the networks, there is that whole segmentation that is happening through software-defined access. So yeah, multiple forms of it in different aspects of security. Again, security is not complicated, but it's not so straightforward as well, right? Depending on where you want to start first and what is most pertinent in your organization, then that there is a solution for it.
Yeah, it comes back to creating that landscape, making sure you know your IT landscape in order to create those protections. Brilliant. Shank, over to you. What's Microsoft doing for its employees now? Brilliant. Top marks.
Finally. So a few things I'm very, very similar to what Shai was mentioning, but a few things that have happened for me personally. I couldn't wait to travel, obviously, and the last couple of months I have been moving around quite a bit. But in the middle of this, we obviously had to take care of a few things. I mean, look at laptops, for instance. Obviously, we have a particular time where the laptop does wear out. How do you basically make sure that your users get a laptop with the least amount of hassle? Obviously, you're not coming to the ID help desk to go ahead and set it up during the pandemic, right? So how do you take care of a scenario like that? So we have something called as Windows Autopilot that took care of a lot of stuff, which basically is you get your laptop shipped to wherever you are, you open it up, you log in, and everything is sorted out for you, right? Keep in mind that you already have multi-factor authentication in this scenario, right? So that helps you to identify as to who you actually are. And this is the device that you trust. And on the background, because we were talking about what cloud brings as an advantage, all the applications that you're supposed to get, it is pushed down from the cloud, right? So it becomes very, very simple for end user. Similarly, there's another thing that also we were looking at, and that is the Great Reset. During the pandemic, of course, irrespective, generally we do like to talk a lot about our managers when we're going out for a drink and all that, right? But then during the pandemic, that also increased quite a bit because all of that frustration kind of boils down somewhere, and the Great Reset was happening. And we saw that within IT sector as well. There was a lot of movement that happened when things opened up. Even with that, what was very fascinating was the moment that we know that there is a person who's handed the resignation, for example, or a new person coming in from a competitor organization, etc. All of these scenarios were very, very smoothly handled because it was just policy driven. It was basically, if a person is about to leave the organization, we ensure that there is no tampering of data, there's no data leakage and all of that. For the end users, it became really, really smooth, right? So we could continue to work in our convenience. And just like Saeed, I love working from home as well. Although I do miss going to office quite a bit, but what we are also doing now is we have built-in system integrated with our calendars. So whenever we do want to reserve a spot in office, we do want to book a lunch, etc., etc., it's very, very hassle-free. So we've smoothed out all the workflows. So for end users, you don't face the brunt of it because there is already too much of grievances in the last 2 years. So Microsoft don't want to add on a little more to that, right? So yeah, so those are a couple of things that Microsoft has done.
It's really great. And we haven't touched on what you did right at the start in terms of that insider threat and how at different points of the employee's journey with the company, that threat can certainly increase, and levers is a massive area that needs attention around how you're going to deal with that offboarding process. So Chris, maybe we come to you, and how does Kroll manage its cybersecurity defenses currently?
Well, I mean, Kroll is basically we offer the full suite of cybersecurity services. We don't offer physical products or anything like that. We're basically consultants. So we offer proactive services, things like security posture assessments, HIPAA assessments, incident preparation, and retain. So we do retainers for incident response, so that if the worst does happen, then we're ready to go. We've got a disaster recovery plan waiting to put into production. We also do, again, incident response, which is what I do pretty much every day. Forensic investigations, which are normally part of the same process to find out how these guys got into your systems and how to stop them getting in again. And a whole raft of other services around governance, virtual CISO services, Chief Information Security Officer, virtual CIO services. Yeah, we do everything around cybersecurity. Kroll's been around for nearly 50 years now. We're based out of the US, started in corporate investigations, and right now, again, we offer a multitude of services. And I believe you wanted me to talk about the Cyber Essentials scheme.
Yeah, it'd be great if we could go on to, I mean, you've given us a tip already in terms of Office 360 multi-factor authentication. Yeah, if you could go on to talk about different things that Singapore offers in terms of supporting companies with their cyber defenses.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we were talking about was where people can go to find the resources to help themselves and to understand, how they can better improve their preparedness and systems and all that kind of stuff. So Singapore, as you probably heard, does the Cyber Essentials scheme, which is fantastic. It's if you go to their front page, you'll see an infographic on there, and it pretty much gives you everything that you need to know as a business as a starting point in cybersecurity. So it mentions things like understanding your assets, which we've already spoken about, secure configurations, antivirus, updating your PCs, which I don't think, well, not just your PCs, but your servers and your switches and your routers, all of that kind of stuff, which we haven't touched on yet, but that's a very important one. Backup is another one. Now, backup, again, from my point of view, is the one thing that it's the linchpin when somebody gets breached. They think they've got backups, and generally, for some reason, they don't. They've been encrypted themselves. They're just not available. They haven't worked properly. So having proper backup strategy is important, and not only that, testing that backup strategy. And then the final item that they mentioned there is response. So basically having a plan for when things go wrong. Obviously, I just spoke about is something that Kroll does quite a lot. We make sure that our clients are ready should the worst happen. Other places you can go for information are, for example, the NCSC, which is the UK government's equivalent. and they've got some really good guidance on there. They've really got a wealth of information, and also the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. These guys in the last few years have really been going out of their way to produce really solid and as simple as possible information. Some of it's not as simple as you would imagine, but they've obviously realized that they need to get that information out there in a way that people can digest without being IT experts. And I think they've done a good job of it. So I mean, there are 3 places to go where you can find out more about cybersecurity in general and how you can apply it to your business.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. And the new CSA Essentials mark, as you say, for me, it's just fantastic in terms of how it segments the different areas for even the smallest of companies to be considering and making decisions on how to take action to protect themselves. Excellent. So we've come to that point where we'll open for any Q&A. Please just do stick it into the chat box and it will fly its way over to our panel. I will start with one that was submitted earlier. So we have touched on different areas that companies need to invest in, the most important areas. We've even had some of those quick tips that have come through. But are there any other easy fixes that absolutely coming off this call? Actually, I'll reword it. What is that thing that coming off this call people need to start straight away? Shank, we'll go to you. Start with.
Don't use the same password that you use for Facebook for your corporate. Maybe start there. If you are not sure if you've been hacked for your personal accounts, you have. So if you look at a site like haveibeenpawned.com, for example, check out if you do see that you have the same passwords that you're using for your corporate. Now go ahead and check if your local accounts have been passed. Rather these social accounts have been hacked. You will see that for a hacker, that's one of the very easy ways to get into your corporate. That's one thing. Another thing is I'm obviously not going to repeat MFA, but that's something that is super important for sure. But just keep in mind that is not the all of it. You should also know that during the pandemic, we also got a lot of fatigue because of advertisements and not just compassion fatigue. So people kept looking at where do I spend my time on. So Netflix and Amazon Prime and all these things actually came to the fore, which also meant that there were a lot more high quality files that were put into torrents. And if you're not going to be, if you're not willing to pay your subscription fee, and if you're going to go and get through torrents, you are opening up for attacks in any case, right? So no matter how good your strategies are, if you still follow these equivalents and you're letting it open up, then you are still letting a way into your environment. It could be something as simple as executing a keyword logger or something like that, right? Another thing to keep in mind from Singapore, especially, we are in a rise of phone-based scam calls. If somebody tells you that they're a cybersecurity expert and they are actually getting a lot of signals coming in from your laptop or your phone and they have to fix it, they're lying. Do not allow them in. Do not go ahead and install any file that they ask you to do, right? So, and this is absolutely on the rise. So just keep that in mind that, very simple things can take you a far way.
Absolutely. And it comes down to, we talk about the sophistication, we talk about AI, machine learning, but actually the rise of the attacks, certainly in the last few months, phone scamming. And it's really interesting how the attackers are actually drawing down on basics. And I just want to repeat what Shank suggested there in terms of the website. Have I Been Pawned? And pawned is spelt without the A. It's a fantastic resource that you can stick in your credentials, and you can just see the terrifying amount of times that different passwords that you think are secure actually might have been stolen. So really great. Said, can we just go to you? Just again, what do people need to come off this webinar and do straight away?
Yeah, maybe 3 tips that I could maybe impart is that security doesn't have to be difficult, right? You just have to start somewhere. I would say that with this transition to hybrid work, people wanting more flexibility, move your security perimeter from that castle wall that Chris mentioned into the endpoint, because every user needs to be seen as a network of one, and how you kind of secure those users would be very key, right? And this will kind of help with regards to things like the phishing scams that have been coming up as well. If they're going on a corporate device, that potentially could be stopped, right? Because the security system is already implemented there. The other thing that I would say is really important is user awareness. I think this was touched on a little bit earlier as well, but a lot of the compromises that we see is really down to social engineering and then people not knowing that this is indeed a scam or a phish, right? And user awareness, I think it's really important, whether it be done through an educational campaign where there are certain solutions out there, even Cisco, or it's just as simple as a blog page that is written, right? So when somebody tries to access a particular website and then there is a blog page that is written with some description on why, right? Then that creates a little bit of awareness as well. And the third thing I could say is, if you don't know how well you're doing in security today in your organization with regards to posture, just reach out to someone, right? Do a security awareness health check. We could do that for you. Or if you want a very comprehensive one, I would say go to Kroll, and I'm sure they have the services in place, right? Yeah, but I think it's important to know, you don't know what you don't, right? So having more knowledge and then working on it will be important.
Yeah, exactly that. Certainly don't bury your head in the sand. That is, the worst thing that you come off this call and do. So Chris, let's a question's just come in, making this all a bit more real for us. So if social accounts have been hacked, what is the next step that the individual needs to take?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on things like Facebook and how you work with them, but the one thing that you really need to bear in mind is, where else have you used that password? Where else have you used those credentials? This is the biggest thing that people don't think about. So let's say their Office 365 password gets owned. They change the password and forget about it. They forget about the fact that that's being used in 10 other places. It's so common. I'm afraid I can't be help desk for Facebook, but just be aware. I mean, one of the points I was going to make was, which has already been made, was, reuse of passwords is a really bad thing to do, and people should consider using things like password managers, so that they can create completely random passwords and store it in a database, and then they can just insert that into the website or portal that they need to go in at the time. I can't recommend password managers enough.
And maybe I can add on to this, right? So I think the one thing that is really important for users to know is not to utilize the corporate credentials with your personal credentials. A lot of cybersecurity people, I think, out there don't even have much social media. so that's really how people typically get breached, the first thing. And in organizations, probably something like a single sign-on would help a great deal, instead of having different passwords for different applications, because once one of those username password combinations gets leaked, it is a way for people, the bad actors, to get in, right? So on the IT side, try to simplify it through things like single sign-ons, and then have a policy in place where you would have to change your passwords every now and then. And on the user side, don't use your corporate credentials for your personal applications. Yeah.
Zhang, did you have something to add?
Yeah. So two things. I mean, if you do look at whenever social logins are hacked, they're not just necessarily hacked through Facebook directly, through any of the social media platforms directly, right? Because what happens is you use these social logins to log into other applications as well, right? And it makes it easier for you to log in. So if you, for example, if you go to howhaveibeenpawned.com, you'll see that it's not that your Facebook account directly has been hacked or something. It could be that you use the Facebook login to access some other application and those applications have been hacked, right? That's kind of the issue with social login hack-ins at this point of time, because it becomes a little harder to trace as to where the hack actually happened. But keep in mind that, as Chris was mentioning, that the one thing to probably do, and I'm talking as a person for whom, I've faced this issue myself before, right? So basically you will obviously go ahead and change your passwords across, but for example, if you use the Microsoft Authenticator app, what also happens is you are now creating the two-factor token on top of it, so you avoid further hacks that are happening, right? So especially with and it could be for Google, for LinkedIn, for Facebook, whatever be the case, it's like how it works with your bank OTP equivalent on the Authenticator app. So that creates another layer on top of it so that the next time it doesn't get hacked. But the principle remains the same. Remember that the more number of times that you go ahead, and it's easy right now, right? Using your phone, going ahead and like accessing all these different applications using IDs. So just make sure that you have that other factor that is built into place, and it's free in any case. So you don't have to invest anything on it.
Absolutely. I'll just move on to another question. And Chris, I'm going to come to you for this one. One thing we haven't touched on right now is people, employees, experts with cybersecurity credentials. So, a lot of the people listening into this webinar will be thinking about trying to bolster their teams. But then immediately, newspapers are all talking about the shortage of those with cyber expertise. So can you talk a little bit about how to overcome that, and also what kind of credentials people, leadership teams should be looking for when they're bringing people into their IT and security teams?
Well, that's a tricky one. I've always thought that IT people, they're not brainiacs or anything like that. They just have a penchant for figuring stuff out. They just, they're brave enough to press the button a few times and see if it works. And I think that's great, because you get these great technologists who can make anything happen. But the problem is that when you go into the security domain, unfortunately, those guys sometimes don't think about the implications of making it work. So a lot of the breaches that I come across, these ostensibly fantastic IT managers they've made it work and they've put a smile on the CEO's face, but they've completely opened their environment to threat actors just to walk in the door. So, I mean, I can certainly say, and I said it before, hire the right guys, hire smart guys, and guys that are willing to think outside of the box. But also train them and help them to heighten their awareness and respect. If you've got the right guy, respect what he tells you. Don't say, right, I want you to make that work, and I don't care how you do it. You need to support them to create a secure infrastructure. These are the kind of things that I see all of the time. The IT manager doesn't really understand things from a security point of view. He's being instructed to carry something out, and he's either failed to do something that he should have done, or he's done something that he shouldn't have done. And that causes almost 100% of breaches.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Certainly when we're looking at bringing people into that cyber area, it's more about those problem solving skills that we've mentioned it before, the ability to look holistically rather than necessarily the traditional computer science type of background, which I think is, you know, giving that diversity to us being able to fight back to the bad actors. So
by the same token, these smart guys need to know when to put the brakes on and stop and look around, rather than just making things happen. Like I say, it's over zealousness sometimes that causes the issues. So unfortunately, IT practitioners' biggest benefits can also be their Achilles heel and cause them to make mistakes that shouldn't have been made.
Oh, Chris, our budgets are disappearing with your warnings, but no, it's exactly that point. And I suppose the other piece that you touched on is that continuous learning element to it, and making sure that those that are protecting your IT systems are being given enough time and enough tools to be able to understand what's happening externally. Because there's no such thing as an expert one day, the next day it could be a completely different element that you're fielding. So brilliant. We're just coming into the closing minutes. So I just want to check if any of our panelists, is there any closing comments or remarks that we've not touched on yet that you think is vital that we bring up? No. Okay, well, thank you so much. And I know we could keep going for another hour, but I will have to bring the webinar to a close. There are other, if you enjoyed this, British Chamber of Commerce events coming up. There's one on the 26th of April regarding the 8 biggest tax and estate planning mistakes that you shouldn't be making, but probably are. We have a Myanmar business update on the 27th of April, and we have the general meeting on the 28th of April. There'll also be a feedback form for any comments in terms of how this webinar went. We'd really value your feedback to make these even better going forward. And so that just leaves me to say thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting hearing from all the different views, and thank you everyone who joined us to listen in.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.